Truth is never silent. It confronts us the moment we dare to stand alone before our own inner voice. Kierkegaard revealed this fracture long before our age drowned itself in constant commentary. He declared that the individual is the birthplace of meaning, and in doing so, he stripped away the comfort of the crowd. What we fear is not isolation, but the demand to answer the question we spend our lives postponing. Who am I when no one is watching, approving, or applauding? Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Yet Kierkegaard spoke these truths long before the digital chorus of opinions, long before identity became something curated, and long before the world of 2025 turned attention into currency. He insisted that the self is not found in collective noise, but in the tension of standing alone. And in the outline before us, his challenge sharpens. The crowd is untruth, the birth of the single individual, the tremor of freedom, the wound of despair, the necessity of choosing, the leap beyond reason, the silence of Abraham, the weight of the moment, and the lifelong task of becoming oneself. What follows is not merely analysis, but confrontation. Each chapter demands that we strip away the borrowed voices and meet the one voice we cannot escape, our own. And with that recognition, the path opens toward the body of this work, where Kierkegaard's thought becomes a mirror that refuses to lie. Truth fractures the moment a human being surrenders himself to the crowd. This is Kierkegaard's first warning, sharp as a blade cutting through the illusions we cling to. The crowd is not merely a physical assembly of bodies. It is a spiritual atmosphere, a soft suffocation, where the individual escapes from the weight of being responsible for his own existence. The crowd offers comfort at the price of authenticity, belonging at the price of inwardness, certainty at the price of truth. And yet most people choose this bargain willingly, almost gratefully, because the alternative terrifies them: to stand alone, unprotected, unmasked, carrying the full burden of being a self. Kierkegaard understood that the greatest danger to a human life is not sin, not failure, not even despair, but the quiet disappearance of the individual into the warm fog of the collective. When one dissolves into the crowd, one no longer thinks, but repeats. One no longer chooses, but follows. One no longer exists inwardly, but performs outwardly. The crowd becomes a surrogate self, a convenient replacement for the terrifying work of self-reflection. It gives ready-made opinions, socially acceptable emotions, and a prepackaged sense of belonging. Yet, beneath this comfort lies a silent catastrophe, the death of individuality. Why do people run so eagerly toward this dissolution? Why does the individual fear becoming himself? Kierkegaard answers with brutal simplicity. Because inwardness requires courage. Because solitude reveals truths that the crowd never forces us to confront. Because being a self is not an automatic condition, but an ethical task, one that demands relentless honesty and unflinching responsibility. To step away from the crowd is to expose oneself to the raw winds of freedom. Freedom sounds attractive in theory, but in practice, it is terrifying. Freedom means possibility. Possibility means choice. And choice means accountability. When the individual stands alone, without the reassuring echo of the crowd, he becomes visible to himself. His motives, his fears, his contradictions, his unfulfilled potential all rise to the surface. The crowd shields him from this confrontation. It offers distraction where inwardness would demand reflection. It offers noise where silence would reveal truth. It offers approval where authenticity would require solitude. The modern world has only amplified the seduction of the crowd. In the age of digital noise, the crowd is no longer an occasional gathering. It is a constant presence, a chorus of unexamined opinions, a marketplace of identities ready for consumption. Social media manufactures belonging at scale. Algorithms feed us ideas before we have time to form our own. Outrage becomes a form of communal excitement. Trends dictate thought. Public opinion becomes a substitute for personal conviction. The crowd has become omnipresent, intimate, and invasive, entering the smallest corners of our mental life. To live in 2025 is to be surrounded by the crowd, even in solitude. The individual faces a paradox. Never has the world proclaimed individuality more loudly. Never has the individual been more deeply absorbed into the collective machinery of influence, persuasion, and imitation. The result is a self that looks independent, but is hollow within. A self that confuses visibility with identity, expression with authenticity, performance with existence. Kierkegaard's insight cuts through this illusion. He reminds us that individuality is not something we possess by default. It is something we must acquire. It requires deliberate rejection of the thoughtless solidarity that the crowd provides. It requires stepping back from the noise, even when the noise embodies everything familiar and comforting. It requires reclaiming the inner voice that has been drowned by the sheer volume of collective chatter. The crowd is untruth because it removes the individual's need to confront himself. When surrounded by others, one can hide from the difficult questions. Am I living my own life or the life expected of me? Do I believe what I claim to believe, or am I repeating the beliefs of the majority? Do I choose my path, or do I drift along the path chosen for me? These questions are heavy, unsettling, destabilizing. The crowd spares us the weight of answering them by giving us something far easier: conformity. Conformity is the anesthesia of the self. It quiets the anxiety of freedom. It silences the whisper of individuality. It replaces the responsibility of choice with the comfort of imitation. But Kierkegaard insists that this comfort is a lie. A person who dissolves into the crowd may feel safe, but he has surrendered the one thing that makes life meaningful: the task of becoming a self. Without inwardness, even a successful life becomes a performance lacking substance. Without individual reflection, even moral convictions become hollow slogans. Without personal responsibility, even belonging becomes a form of spiritual sleep. Kierkegaard does not condemn the crowd because it is large. He condemns it because it makes the individual smaller. When the individual hides in the collective, he forgets that truth is always subjective, that it must be lived, not borrowed. The crowd cannot live truth for anyone. It can only simulate conviction. But conviction without inwardness is empty. It collapses under pressure, bends to convenience, and evaporates in crisis. Only the individual who stands alone before his own consciousness can grasp the weight of truth deeply enough for it to shape his life. The psychological mechanisms behind this avoidance are profound. Humans fear isolation because isolation strips away illusions of self-importance. The crowd inflates us, allowing us to borrow significance from numbers and noise. Alone, we confront our vulnerability. Alone, we confront our uncertainty. Alone, we confront the fact that our life is not yet what it could be. This confrontation generates anxiety. Anxiety not of failure, but of possibility. For to recognize what one could become is to recognize what one has not yet become. The unformed self flees from this anxiety into the crowd. But the self longing for truth must learn to endure it. Therefore, the first movement in Kierkegaard's philosophy is not an ascent into abstract theory, but a descent into honest solitude. It is the painful withdrawal of the self from the comfort of collective identity. It is an existential amputation, the cutting away of roles, masks, and expectations until the individual stands stripped to his essence. This stripping is not destruction, it is revelation. Only in this nakedness does one encounter the first possibility of becoming. Yet solitude alone does not guarantee authenticity. One can be physically alone and still inwardly bound to the crowd. True solitude requires internal separation from the expectations that have shaped us without our consent. It requires noticing how much of our thinking is imitation, how much of our fear is inherited, how much of our desire is borrowed. This noticing is surgical and uncompromising. It demands intellectual honesty, it demands emotional courage, it demands standing face to face with the truth that the self we present to the world might not be the self we are called to become. From this rupture begins the transformation of inwardness. The individual starts to hear the subtle voice of conscience that was drowned out by the crowd. He begins to sense the difference between the values he performs and the ones he authentically holds. He begins to feel responsible, not to the expectations around him, but to the truth within him. This shift marks the birth of the single individual, Kierkegaard's central figure, the one who stands alone, not in arrogance, but in responsibility. And as the individual takes this first step out of the crowd, a deeper question arises, one even more unsettling, even more demanding. If I am no longer defined by the collective, then who am I? What remains when the noise is gone, when the borrowed identities fall away, when the external world no longer tells me who to be? It is in this silence that the real self first begins to take shape. Not through imitation, not through approval, but through the raw, trembling act of becoming. The self does not come into being merely by separating from the crowd. Separation is only the shock that awakens it. What follows is far more demanding. It is the slow, unforgiving work of becoming a single individual. Kierkegaard insists that this is the true beginning of life. Without becoming inwardly independent, a person may breathe, move, achieve, perform, but he does not yet exist. His actions are echoes. His thoughts are borrowed. His convictions are inherited. His identity is a collage assembled from the expectations of others. To become an individual is to strip all that away until something undeniably one's own emerges. But the moment one steps out of the crowd, a strange silence surrounds him. A silence that feels like emptiness at first. Without the noise of collective affirmation, without the illusion of shared certainty, the person confronts an inner space he has never learned to navigate. The crowd had filled that space with imitation. Now that imitation has dissolved, he must decide whether he has the courage to inhabit the emptiness rather than flee back into the familiar captivity of belonging. Kierkegaard calls this emptiness possibility. But possibility is not comforting. It is vast, cold, unstructured. It demands that the individual generate his own meaning rather than receive it passively. Most people prefer the ready-made identity of the crowd precisely because the self, forged from within, feels unstable, vulnerable, unfinished. To become an individual is to stand in that unfinishedness without seeking an external scaffold to hold oneself upright. The first task of individuality is learning to think without applause. Most people do not think, they react, they absorb. They adopt conclusions shaped for them by collective forces. Even their doubts are borrowed. Even their rebellion follows familiar patterns. True thinking is solitary. It does not ask who agrees. It does not ask who approves. It does not ask how the thought will be perceived. It asks only whether it is true to the inner voice that has finally emerged from beneath the ruins of imitation. But this voice is fragile in its infancy. It can be drowned easily by comparison, by insecurity, by the internalized echoes of the crowd. The individual must learn to protect this voice, to give it room to grow, to let it articulate itself even when trembling. The courage required is immense. Not the courage of physical risk, but the courage of inward exposure. To reveal one's own thoughts without the armor of consensus is to stand spiritually naked before the world. Independence of mind is not defiance. It is authenticity. Defiance still depends on the crowd. It positions itself against others, reacting rather than choosing. The truly independent person does not define himself in contrast to the majority. He defines himself through relation to truth, through fidelity to his own inwardness. His thoughts arise not from opposition, but from integrity. He is alone not because he despises others, but because the path of becoming demands solitude at its earliest stages. Solitude becomes the crucible of selfhood, not exile, not rejection, but the quiet laboratory where the individual experiments with thinking, feeling, choosing without external reinforcement. Solitude tests whether one's convictions exist independently of validation. It tests whether the self collapses without applause or whether it learns to stand on its own trembling legs. Kierkegaard insists that the measure of inner maturity is the ability to remain oneself in solitude. Only the self that survives solitude is real. This does not mean hostility toward the world. It means independence within it. The individual does not withdraw permanently from others. He returns to them eventually, but returns transformed. He no longer seeks identity through them. He no longer bends to their expectations in order to silence his own anxiety. He meets them as one who already is, not one who is desperately trying to become through reflection in their eyes. To become a single individual is to reclaim authorship of one's inner life. Authorship requires responsibility. The individual can no longer blame the crowd for his choices. He can no longer hide behind tradition, culture, family, or convention. Every decision becomes a mirror reflecting his level of inward integrity. The crowd allows diffusion of responsibility. The individual allows none. Whatever he chooses, he must own. This ownership is the birthplace of dignity. But responsibility also intensifies the struggle. Once the individual steps out of the collective, he no longer has the luxury of unexamined living. Every value must be interrogated. Every desire must be scrutinized. Every motive must be stripped of its disguises. He begins to discover how much of his previous self was constructed from fear rather than conviction. Fear of disapproval, fear of isolation, fear of standing alone in truth. The individual recognizes that he has lived much of his life as a role rather than a reality. Roles are protective. They are predictable. They give the illusion of identity. But roles collapse the moment one asks whether they express anything inwardly genuine. Kierkegaard demands the ruthless honesty to acknowledge that the roles we play often serve to shield us from the work of becoming. The student who studies because it is expected. The professional who succeeds because ambition is rewarded. The socially impressive person who performs charm but lacks intimacy. All are trapped, not by external conditions, but by internal avoidance. To become a single individual is to refuse to continue living through surfaces. The individual begins to peel off every layer that feels artificially attached. Reputation becomes secondary. Applause becomes irrelevant. Approval becomes a distraction. What matters is whether one's inner life matches one's outer actions. This alignment is rare. It is also the only path to authenticity. Independence of mind demands independence of existence, and this independence does not arise through rebellion or isolation, but through grounded inwardness. The individual must learn to walk through the world without absorbing its noise into his core. He must be present among people, yet not dissolved into their emotional climate. He must engage without being defined, listen without being shaped, participate without being owned. This balance between inward autonomy and outward participation is delicate. It requires vigilance. The crowd's influence is subtle. It seeps through language, habit, expectation. The individual must continually return to himself, continually check whether he is thinking from within or merely echoing from without. This returning is not a one-time act. It is a lifelong discipline. Kierkegaard knew that the world will not reward such inwardness. The world celebrates conformity disguised as success. It admires public virtue while ignoring private incoherence. It praises confidence even when confidence masks emptiness. The individual who rejects these values will appear strange, even threatening. His independence exposes the dependence of others. His authenticity highlights their performance. His inward strength reveals their hidden frailty. Thus, becoming a single individual often invites misunderstanding. But misunderstanding is the price of authenticity. To live truthfully is to be unrecognizable to those who live through imitation. To remain inwardly free is to stand apart even while standing among. This apartness is not alienation, it is clarity. It is the refusal to betray oneself in order to fit invisibly into the expectations of others. The more deeply the individual commits to himself, the more intensely he feels the distance between genuine being and superficial belonging. But this distance is not a wound, it is a threshold. It marks the transition from an externally constructed identity to an internally sustained one. And with this transition comes a new capacity, the ability to choose. Choice becomes possible only when the individual has reclaimed his inwardness. Before that, what appears as choice is often merely reaction to pressure, expectation, habit, fear. But the inwardly grounded self can finally choose from freedom rather than reflex. His choices express his essence rather than conceal it. They clarify him rather than distort him. Yet with this freedom comes a weight the crowd never has to carry. Real choice reveals real consequences. Real freedom reveals real responsibility. And the dizzying magnitude of this responsibility introduces a new psychological force that Kierkegaard saw more clearly than anyone before him. The force that arises the moment an individual recognizes the vastness of his freedom in the solitude of his accountability. A force we now call anxiety, not as a disorder, but as the birthplace of authentic existence. Existence does not open itself in a single stroke. It unfolds in stages, each demanding the death of a previous version of the self. The individual who has stepped out of the crowd, who has begun to feel the weight of inwardness and the trembling of freedom, soon discovers that he is not simply choosing thoughts or identities. He is choosing modes of being. Kierkegaard names these modes the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. They are not categories of behavior, but climates of the soul, ways of standing in relation to oneself, to others, and to the absolute. Each stage reveals something the previous one concealed. Each stage seduces, challenges, overwhelms, and each stage, once encountered honestly, demands transcendence. Yet no stage can be skipped. The individual must inhabit them fully until their internal contradictions force him forward. He moves not because he chooses advancement, but because remaining becomes impossible. The aesthetic stage is where most lives begin and where many stay forever. It is the life oriented toward pleasure, stimulation, novelty. Here, meaning is created through experience, not commitment. The aesthetic person pursues what is interesting, avoids what is burdensome, and refuses anything that limits his freedom in the name of responsibility. To him, life is a series of possibilities to be tasted and discarded. His fear is repetition. His enemy is boredom. His God is intensity. The aesthetic person constructs his identity from impressions. He moves endlessly, not toward anything, but away from the weight of decision. For the aesthetic soul, every moment must be kept open, unbound. This is not freedom, it is evasion. It is the refusal to choose the self, because any choice excludes possibilities and aesthetic existence. Worships possibility above all else. The trouble is that the aesthetic life collapses under its own emptiness. Pleasure becomes diluted by repetition. Novelty loses its charm the moment it is consumed. Desire exhausts itself in its own pursuit. The aesthetic individual becomes a spectator of his own life, chasing experiences that no longer satisfy and avoiding commitments that might anchor him into something meaningful. What appears as freedom becomes paralysis. What appears as choice becomes drift. Kierkegaard does not condemn the aesthetic life. He reveals its limits. It is a necessary beginning because it exposes the hunger that pleasure cannot satisfy. It forces the individual to see that possibility alone is not enough. The self longs not only to experience, but to become. And becoming demands responsibility. Thus the aesthetic stage cracks open. Through the crack enters despair. Despair is not sorrow. It is self-confrontation. It is the moment the individual recognizes that he cannot endlessly escape himself through distraction. The pleasures that once filled him now mock him. The freedom he worshipped feels hollow. The self, neglected and unchosen, begins to revolt. Despair forces the individual to acknowledge that he has lived superficially, skimming the surface of existence while avoiding the depths. In this revolt begins the transition to the ethical stage. The ethical stage is the life of commitment, duty, principle. Here the individual no longer values possibility over actuality. He chooses. He binds himself. He assumes responsibility for his actions, his relationships, his identity. Freedom is no longer measured by how many exits remain open, but by how consistently one can act according to one's chosen values. The ethical person stands for the first time with inward authority. This transformation is profound. The self becomes solid. Identity becomes coherent. Life gains structure. In the ethical stage, the individual recognizes his obligations to others, to society, to himself. He understands that actions have consequences, and that freedom without responsibility is destructive. He feels the weight of his choices not as constraint, but as dignity. But the ethical stage has its own limits. Duty can harden into rigidity. Principle can become self-righteousness. The ethical person, proud of his consistency, may forget the fragility beneath his moral confidence. He may believe he has achieved full selfhood simply by adopting universal norms. Yet norms, even noble ones, cannot fully contain existence. A moment will come when ethical reasoning fails, when duty contradicts duty, when the demands of life exceed the capacity of rational justification. This is where anxiety returns, but now in a deeper form. Not the anxiety of too many possibilities, as in the aesthetic stage, but the anxiety of too much responsibility. The ethical person realizes he cannot perfect himself through will alone. He cannot secure meaning solely through duty. He cannot guarantee the outcome of his choices, no matter how noble they are. His moral logic fractures under the weight of lived experience. And so the ethical stage, like the aesthetic before it, begins to tremble. The trembling reveals a truth too heavy for the ethical mind to carry. The self cannot become whole by its own efforts. There are contradictions in existence that no moral system can resolve. There are demands of the heart that duty cannot satisfy. There are choices so absolute, so paradoxical, that reason cannot explain or justify them. The individual stands at the threshold, and beyond the threshold lies the religious stage. The religious stage is not a set of doctrines. It is not blind belief. It is not submission to external authority. Kierkegaard's religious life is an inward leap into a relationship with the Absolute, a relationship that cannot be proven, cannot be rationalized, cannot be mediated by the crowd. It is the highest form of individuality because it demands absolute inward commitment. Where the aesthetic person refuses responsibility and the ethical person embraces responsibility, the religious person entrusts responsibility to the Absolute while still acting with full inward seriousness. This paradox is the core of the religious stage. It is the recognition that the individual is finite, yet responsible for infinite decisions. It is the acceptance that human reason can guide but cannot complete the journey. It is the surrender of control without the surrender of self. The religious individual stands alone before the Absolute, just as he once stood alone before the crowd. But now the solitude is not terror, it is reverence. In the religious stage, the individual does not abandon ethics. He transcends its limits. He does not reject freedom, he deepens it. He does not escape despair, he transforms it into devotion. Faith becomes not a replacement for rationality, but the continuation of rationality beyond its breaking point. It is a leap, but a conscious leap, made not in ignorance, but in clarity. The religious person commits with the entirety of his being, and this total commitment gives his life a coherence neither pleasure nor duty could provide. It allows him to confront suffering without collapsing, uncertainty without fleeing, contradiction without despairing. He becomes capable of absolute passion, something the aesthetic individual simulates but never achieves, something the ethical individual seeks but cannot secure. The transition through these stages is not linear. One does not graduate from one to the next. One is pulled, pushed, broken, reassembled. The aesthetic remains within the ethical. The ethical remains within the religious. Each stage preserves the earlier stages, but transforms them through deeper inwardness. Kierkegaard offers no promise that the individual will reach the highest stage. Many remain in the aesthetic life, oscillating between desire and boredom. Some stabilize in the ethical, finding comfort in structure and responsibility. Few have the courage to confront the paradoxes that give birth to the religious life. And even those who enter it do so trembling. But trembling is not failure. Trembling is the mark of someone who stands before truth. The individual who has walked through the aesthetic and the ethical stages carries within him an awareness the crowd will never understand. He knows pleasure cannot save him. He knows duty cannot secure him. He knows despair is not an end, but a beginning. And he senses that existence demands something far deeper from him than consistency or satisfaction. It demands a total inward commitment. This commitment, invisible to the crowd and incomprehensible to the purely ethical mind, will soon take form in the one experience that exposes the fragility of human freedom and the vastness of human destiny. A force that grips the self the moment it realizes how much depends on it and how little it can control. Anxiety enters not as an intruder, but as a revelation. It is the moment the individual, having stepped out of the crowd, having claimed inwardness, having passed through the seduction of the aesthetic and the rigors of the ethical, finally sees the terrifying truth of freedom. Freedom is not comfort. Freedom is not possibility without cost. Freedom is the dizzying awareness that nothing prevents you from becoming what you are not yet, and nothing protects you from failing to become it. Kierkegaard names this state anxiety, the dizziness of freedom, the spiritual vertigo that strikes when the self stands before the open abyss of its own potential. Anxiety is not fear. Fear has an object. Fear points to something definite, the threat outside, the danger approaching, the loss imaginable. Anxiety points to nothing because it points to everything. It arises not from something in the world, but from the possibility contained within the self. Anxiety is the trembling of the soul when it realizes it is free to choose, and therefore free to destroy itself or free to remake itself. This trembling is the first sign of spiritual adulthood. The child does not feel existential anxiety. The child fears punishment, disapproval, failure, but not freedom. Freedom belongs to the fully awakened self. Only when the individual stands naked before possibility does anxiety tighten around him like a noose woven from his own choices. Anxiety reveals that you are no longer protected by ignorance. You cannot hide behind the crowd. You cannot dissolve into imitation. You cannot borrow meaning or outsource responsibility. You must choose. And in choosing, you expose yourself to yourself. This is why anxiety appears at the precise moment the individual recognizes his independence. The aesthetic life avoided anxiety through distraction. The ethical life attempted to tame anxiety through rules, virtues, and duty. But none of these eliminates it. They only suppress it. The deeper the individual descends in authenticity, the more powerful anxiety becomes. For anxiety belongs not to weakness, but to possibility. It is the cost of becoming a self rather than an echo. Anxiety is the shadow freedom casts. Modern psychology treats anxiety as pathology, as something to be corrected, medicated, or minimized. But Kierkegaard understood anxiety as necessity. Anxiety is not a malfunction. It is the sign that one has encountered the truth of human existence. To eliminate anxiety would be to eliminate freedom. A society that seeks comfort at all costs inevitably flattens individuality. A world that treats anxiety only as illness prevents its citizens from experiencing the spiritual intensity that gives life depth. Yet anxiety is unbearable when misinterpreted. If the individual believes anxiety signals failure, he panics. If he believes anxiety signals danger, he retreats. If he believes anxiety signals defect, he collapses. But if he understands anxiety as the revelation of possibility, then panic becomes awareness. Retreat becomes introspection. Collapse becomes transformation. Anxiety becomes a teacher. It teaches that every choice contains infinite alternatives that will never be realized. It teaches that the self is not a fixed entity, but a responsibility. It teaches that existence cannot be secured through routine or rule. It teaches that you are not the product of your circumstances, but the architect of your becoming. This teaching is violent, yet liberating. It strips life of illusion. It forces inwardness to break through the shell of habit. But anxiety is not uniform. Kierkegaard distinguishes between destructive anxiety and generative anxiety. Destructive anxiety is the attempt to escape freedom. It is the frantic need to anchor oneself in distractions, achievements, identities that promise stability but offer confinement. It is the collapse into addiction to avoid choice. It is the obedience to the crowd to avoid individuality. It is the retreat into rigid morality to avoid ambiguity. Destructive anxiety arises when the individual tries to hide from his own becoming. Generative anxiety is the acceptance of freedom. It is the trembling before possibility, not to flee, but to understand. It is the moment when the self stops running and finally asks, "What do I want? What must I become? What truth demands action from me?" Generative anxiety births authenticity. It forces the self to shed illusions. It is suffering with purpose, and it does not dissolve until a new self emerges. Anxiety deepens with intelligence. The more the individual perceives the complexity of life, the more he recognizes the weight of his choices. Creative individuals feel anxiety intensely because creativity demands freedom. Artists, thinkers, innovators, all those who live from the inner well rather than from external scripts, stand continually before possibility. Their visions expand faster than their structures. Their freedom outpaces their stability. Anxiety becomes the price they pay for seeing beyond the visible horizon. But creative anxiety is not merely artistic. It is existential. It exposes the gap between who one is and who one could become. It reveals the chasm between potential and action. It exposes the tension between the infinite and the finite. This tension is not a flaw. It is the essence of being human. Yet the self, confronted with this infinite freedom, also confronts its own fragility. The individual realizes he can choose wrongly. He can betray himself. He can waste his life. He can sabotage his own becoming. And nothing in existence prevents these outcomes except his own inward vigilance. Anxiety arises from this responsibility. This responsibility is unbearable without inward grounding. Thus, anxiety is not a condition to be eliminated. It is a condition to be navigated. To navigate anxiety requires courage. not the loud courage of conquest, but the silent courage of introspection. It demands the individual lean into the trembling rather than flee from it. It demands recognizing that anxiety is not the enemy of selfhood, but its catalyst. The self is forged in the fire of possibility. Without anxiety, the self remains unformed. But a paradox emerges. Anxiety both threatens and reveals freedom. It immobilizes until understood. It transforms once embraced. This transformation requires a leap, not the final leap of faith that will come later, but a smaller foundational leap, the leap into responsibility. The individual must say, I choose to choose. I refuse to hide. I accept my freedom even when it terrifies me. This acceptance is the beginning of spiritual adulthood. Once anxiety is embraced rather than resisted, something unexpected occurs. The individual becomes capable of deeper clarity. His attention sharpens. His interior life becomes more honest. He begins to distinguish between superficial choices that distract and essential choices that define. Anxiety becomes a lens through which meaning reveals itself. It separates the trivial from the significant. It exposes the contradictions between desire and duty, between fantasy and purpose, between illusion and truth. Anxiety becomes the guardian of authenticity. It warns when one is drifting back into the crowd. It signals when one is betraying oneself. It flares when one settles for comfort instead of becoming. Its presence is not punishment, but guidance. It says, you are free, therefore your choices matter. It says, do not hide. It says, become who you are. Yet anxiety alone cannot complete the transformation. Anxiety awakens possibility, but possibility without direction collapses into despair. Kierkegaard sees despair not as a mood, but as the sickness of refusing to become oneself. Despair is what happens when anxiety reveals freedom and the individual refuses the responsibility that freedom demands. Despair is the shadow that follows anxiety, a deeper confrontation that arises when freedom is no longer merely sensed, but suffered. And it is here, in the collision between freedom and refusal, that the next battleground of the soul opens, where the individual must confront not external forces, not the crowd, not the world, but the quiet, relentless failure to be oneself. Despair does not enter softly. It arrives when every escape has failed, when distraction loses its intoxication, when anxiety reveals the infinite responsibility of freedom and the individual refuses to bear it. Despair is not sadness. Despair is not emotional collapse. Despair is the fracture between what one is and what one knows one must become. It is the sickness of the self that cannot align with itself. And Kierkegaard names it the sickness unto death, not because it ends life, but because it hollows life from within while the body continues to breathe. The modern world misunderstands despair. It treats it as a mood to be corrected, a biochemical imbalance to be medicated, a temporary fog to be lifted. Kierkegaard insists on something far more unsettling. Despair is the most accurate mirror of the self. It is the truth one has avoided finally revealing itself. It is the alarm that rings when the individual has betrayed his own becoming. It begins the moment the self senses that it is living falsely, that it is performing rather than existing, that it is drifting instead of choosing. Despair is the rebellion of the soul against its own neglect. The self is not a fixed entity, but a relation between what one is and what one is called to be. When that relation collapses, the self disintegrates inwardly, not because of external pressure, but because inwardness has been abandoned. Despair is the internal consequence of this abandonment. It grows in the gap between potential and action. It grows wherever the individual hides from responsibility, from truth, from freedom. There are forms of despair that look like strength. The confident professional who outruns his inner emptiness with constant achievement. The admired public figure who performs excellence while feeling nothing underneath. The disciplined moralist who suppresses every desire until his inner life becomes sterile. These individuals do not appear in crisis, yet they are consumed by it. They have built entire identities around avoiding themselves. This avoidance is precisely what feeds despair. Kierkegaard identifies multiple layers of this sickness. The first is despair of not being aware of having a self. This is the despair of the crowds, the despair of those who live externally, who dissolve into roles, routines, and expectations. They do not feel their despair because they have silenced the voice of inwardness so thoroughly it no longer disturbs them. But their stability is fragile. The moment life disrupts their patterns, their constructed self collapses because it has no interior foundation. The second layer is despair of refusing to be oneself. This despair arises when the individual senses his true calling, his deeper desires, his inward truth, but recoils from it. He chooses comfort over transformation, familiarity over authenticity. He knows himself, but rejects himself. This rejection creates a wound no external success can heal. It is the despair of living a life that is recognizable to others, but foreign to oneself. The third layer is despair of wanting to be oneself without the power to ground that self. This is the despair of the person who recognizes his destiny, who senses the depth he must inhabit, but who lacks the inward strength to commit fully. His despair is acute because he sees clearly. The more he understands, the more he suffers the distance between understanding and embodiment. Despair intensifies with awareness, not ignorance. Despair is the agony of unfulfilled necessity. And yet Kierkegaard insists that despair is not only destruction, it is invitation. Despair is the crossroads where the self either collapses or transforms. It forces the individual into the most honest confrontation with freedom. Anxiety reveals the infinite possibilities of choice. Despair reveals the infinite consequences of avoiding choice. Anxiety shows what one could become. Despair shows what one has failed to become. Anxiety whispers freedom. Despair demands responsibility. This is why despair cannot be treated as a temporary emotional disturbance. It is a spiritual event. It signals that the self is attempting to live without grounding, without coherence, without inward truth. No amount of distraction, pleasure, performance, or achievement can silence this signal long term. The deeper the individual tries to outrun despair, the more violently despair returns. It becomes the relentless teacher that refuses to let the self remain false. Despair exposes the self's relationship with itself. The self wants wholeness, but wholeness requires commitment. The self wants authenticity, but authenticity requires sacrifice. The self wants fulfillment, but fulfillment requires abandoning illusions. Despair emerges when these requirements are refused. It is the spiritual consequence of wanting transformation without undergoing transformation. This is why despair intensifies for those who sense their own depth. The more inwardly aware a person becomes, the more despair sharpens. The individual who glimpses the life he's meant to live cannot return to superficiality without inner damage. His despair becomes sharper because his responsibility has grown. Despair is the cost of self-knowledge. And yet despair alone cannot cure itself. The despairing self attempts various strategies to escape its own suffering. It throws itself into pleasure, only to find that pleasure loses flavor. It clings to discipline, only to discover that discipline becomes rigid. It hides in work, hoping that productivity will drown the ache. It performs confidence, hoping that admiration will substitute for authenticity. Each strategy fails because despair is not external. It is the inner protest of a self that has lost its grounding. The only path through despair is inward transformation. This transformation requires that the individual face the truth he has spent his life avoiding. The truth that he cannot be healed by external means, that no achievement can secure him, that no crowd can validate him, that no ethical system can complete him. The self demands a deeper grounding, one that transcends its own finite efforts. Despair becomes the bridge between self-sufficiency and surrender, between the illusion of control and the necessity of inward commitment. The self must choose itself fully, but choosing oneself fully is impossible without grounding the self in something deeper than itself. This paradox is the heart of Kierkegaard's diagnosis. Despair forces the self to realize that it is a relation that cannot sustain itself alone. It must relate to something absolute, something beyond the shifting moods, fears, and desires that constitute the finite self. Despair pushes the individual toward this recognition by dismantling every false foundation he relies on. Thus, despair is the threshold. On one side lies the self, constructed from externalities, from roles, from accomplishments, from public identity. On the other side lies the self, grounded in inward truth. Despair destroys the first, so the second can emerge. It crushes illusions, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Without despair, the self remains shallow. Without despair, inwardness never awakens. Without despair, the individual never becomes capable of the deeper existential commitment that Kierkegaard calls the leap. But before the leap comes a deeper crisis. Despair strips the individual until nothing remains but the raw fact of freedom. No justification holds. No explanation suffices. No external structure can rescue him. He stands alone before an unbearable truth. The self he must become will require a transformation that logic cannot guarantee, discipline cannot produce, and emotion cannot sustain. He faces a choice that cannot be rationally secured, yet must be made with absolute seriousness. This is the moment when despair exhausts its role and hands the individual to the next stage of becoming, a stage where freedom demands commitment beyond reason, where inward truth demands a form of courage that surpasses ethics, and where the self prepares to confront the paradox that lies at the core of existence. Choice is the moment the self steps onto the stage of its own becoming. It is not a gesture. It is not a preference. It is not a calculation weighed on the scales of probability. Choice, for Kierkegaard, is existential creation. It is the act through which the individual declares who he is, not in theory, but in being. And precisely because of this, choice is always accompanied by trembling. After anxiety has revealed the vastness of freedom, after despair has exposed the unbearable cost of refusing oneself, the individual stands before a precipice where no external authority can guide him and no explanation can save him. He must choose, and in choosing, he is created. Choice is the crucible of selfhood. When one chooses trivialities, the self remains shallow. When one chooses from fear, the self becomes confined. When one chooses from imitation, the self dissolves. But when one chooses with inward seriousness, when the decision arises from the deepest layers of consciousness rather than from social expectation or habitual reflex, something irreversible occurs. A self is born. Not the self defined by roles or achievements, but the self defined by commitment. Kierkegaard insists that the individual becomes himself only through decisions that cannot be justified externally. Aesthetic choices can be explained. Ethical choices can be rationalized. Social choices can be defended. But existential choices, the choices that determine not what one does, but who one is, cannot rely on reason alone. They require a confrontation with the irrational freedom of being human. They demand that the individual assume responsibility for his existence without any guarantee of correctness. This is why genuine choice is terrifying. It is a leap into the unknown without the security of certainty. It is the recognition that one cannot think one's way into becoming. One must act. And the action has consequences, not only in the world, but in the inner architecture of the soul. To choose is to bind oneself. To bind oneself is to limit possibility. To limit possibility is to become finite. And becoming finite is the only way to become real. Choice defines existence because existence is not given, it is produced. Most people avoid such choices because they want to preserve possibility without commitment. They want to keep the door of life open so they never have to confront the weight of walking through any particular doorway. They prefer drifting to deciding because drifting seems safer. It preserves the illusion of freedom, even though it slowly dissolves the self into indecision. A life lived without decisive choice becomes a life of quiet erosion. Meaning leaks away. Identity disperses. Responsibility is evaded until it returns as despair. The crowd loves indecision because indecision is controllable. The individual who refuses to choose remains dependent on external validation. He becomes malleable, impressionable, easily shaped by the whims of the collective. His freedom rots in potential rather than crystallizing in action. Kierkegaard sees this clearly. A person who never commits never becomes. He remains a possibility, not a reality. But the moment one chooses with inward seriousness, the relationship to the crowd dissolves. Choice isolates, not because it alienates, but because it requires the individual to stand alone in responsibility. No crowd can choose for you. No authority can carry your decision. No tradition can guarantee your outcome. In the decisive moment, one is radically solitary. This solitude is not punishment, it is dignity. It is the recognition that the self is not a passive product of circumstance, but an active creator of meaning. Choice is not simply a moment, it is a posture toward life. The decisive self chooses again and again, not impulsively, but inwardly. Each choice deepens the self. Each choice shapes the narrative of one's becoming. Each choice closes the distance between potential and actuality. This continuity of decision is the foundation of character. Not inherited character, but lived character. The kind forged through responsibility rather than granted through lineage or training. But choice is not only about external outcomes. It is the meeting point between the finite and the infinite. The decision itself is finite, one action over another, one path over another. But the meaning of the decision is infinite. Human choices shape the inner world. They shape the soul. They shape one's understanding of existence. They shape what kind of person one becomes capable of being. Thus, every serious choice is both a limit and an opening. Choice limits possibility, but it opens identity. It limits wandering, but it opens direction. It limits fantasy, but it opens reality. Through choice, the individual integrates freedom and necessity. Without choice, one has only freedom without grounding, a freedom that dissolves into anxiety. This is why Kierkegaard speaks of the developmental necessity of the decisive moment. The moment is the point where the self no longer delays its own becoming. The moment is where reflection must yield to action. The moment is where inwardness demands incarnation. To choose is to take the truth one has recognized and inscribe it onto the world through action. Reflection without choice becomes cowardice. Choice without reflection becomes chaos. The union of reflection and choice becomes authenticity. Kierkegaard's view of decision contrasts sharply with the modern obsession with optimization. In 2025, people hesitate endlessly because they fear making the wrong choice. They want guarantees. They want certainty. They want outcomes before action. They want the world to confirm their decision before they commit to it. But life offers no such reassurance. The individual must choose without knowing, must decide without predicting, must commit without external validation. The demand for certainty is the enemy of becoming. To choose is to accept uncertainty. To accept uncertainty is to embrace freedom. To embrace freedom is to accept responsibility for the consequences of one's existence. And this acceptance changes everything. Once the individual chooses with inward seriousness, he cannot return to the uncommitted life without fracturing himself. But choice also reveals another truth. Not all decisions are equal. Some choices alter the entire trajectory of the self. Some choices restructure the soul. Some choices redefine the meaning of the past and the shape of the future. Kierkegaard calls these existential choices. They are the choices that cannot be undone by regret or reversed by circumstance. They become part of one's essential story. Such choices are made not with calculation, but with passion, not with arrogance, but with trembling. They require leap rather than logic. They require courage rather than evidence. The courage required is not the courage to risk loss. It is the courage to risk oneself. This risk is the core of existential decision. When the individual chooses who he will become, he risks stabilizing his identity around something he cannot fully understand, yet must fully commit to. This paradox is the birthplace of authenticity. One must choose before knowing, and yet only through choosing does one begin to know. But choice alone cannot carry the self. Decision demands follow-through. Kierkegaard is merciless here. A choice that is not lived is not a choice. It is fantasy. It is wishful thinking. The decisive moment must be followed by decisive existence. Otherwise, the self folds back into despair. Choosing must be embodied in action, repeated in daily commitment, strengthened through adversity. Without embodiment, decisions are illusions. The deeper one chooses, the deeper one becomes. Yet, as the individual deepens through choice, a new kind of existential pressure emerges. Not the anxiety of possibility, not the despair of refusal, but the paradox of choosing when reason reaches its limits. There are decisions for which no ethical system provides guidance. Decisions where duty and desire collide, where moral principles become insufficient, where rational clarity fails to illuminate the path. In such moments, the individual stands at the threshold of something greater than choice alone, a realm where no amount of inward reflection, no clarity of thought, no ethical principle can resolve the contradiction. A realm where decision demands not knowledge but faith. A realm where the self must leap, not because the leap is safe, but because remaining is impossible. The individual, stripped of guarantees, stripped of illusions, stripped even of rational certainty, must now confront the paradox that freedom unveils, where the next step cannot be justified, yet must be taken with absolute inward passion. Faith enters where reason fractures. The individual who has reached the limits of ethical clarity, who stands trembling before choices that no rational system can resolve, finally confronts the territory that Kierkegaard calls the absurd. Here the mind is no longer sufficient. Here logic reveals its impotence. Here the self faces situations in which every moral rule collapses, every explanation fails, every calculation dissolves into contradiction. And yet the individual must still choose. It is in this impossible moment that faith appears, not as belief without evidence, but as the inner passion that carries the self beyond the point where reason can no longer guide it. Faith is not comfort. Faith is not consolation. Faith is the most violent demand ever placed on a human soul. A purely rational mind wishes to avoid contradiction. It wants coherence, explanation, structure. It wants a world in which duty aligns perfectly with desire, in which decisions can be justified before they are acted upon. But existence does not obey rational order. It throws the individual into dilemmas where doing the right thing looks wrong, where doing the ethical thing feels insufficient, where every available path threatens some part of one's identity. It is precisely here, at the collision of the finite and the infinite, that faith becomes necessary. Faith begins when thought breaks, but faith, in the Kierkegaardian sense, is not blind. It is not obedience without understanding. It is not surrender to authority. It is not a retreat from reason. Faith is the inward movement through which the self commits to something higher than itself without the guarantee of certainty. It is the self standing alone before the absolute, with no mediator, no crowd, no universal justification. It is a solitary leap into meaning where no external logic can follow. Faith requires solitude because no one can leap for you. The crowd can imitate belief. It can perform ritual. It can echo doctrine. But imitation is not faith. Faith demands inward intensity, and inward intensity cannot be borrowed. The leap must be taken by the individual alone, without witnesses, without applause, without the comfort of imagining that others understand. The leap is a confrontation between the single individual and the paradox at the heart of existence. The paradox is this: the self is finite, yet it longs for the infinite. The self is limited, yet it reaches for the absolute. The self is bound by necessity, yet it seeks ultimate freedom. Reason cannot bridge this gap. Ethics cannot bridge this gap. Only faith can confront the contradiction without dissolving it. To live by faith is to accept that meaning cannot be proven, only lived. Here the irrational becomes the birthplace of authenticity. Rationality seeks to control life. Faith accepts that life cannot be controlled. Rationality wants guarantees. Faith begins where guarantees end. Rationality wants a plan. Faith moves without a map. Rationality wants consistency. Faith embraces paradox as the only honest response to the human condition. Faith is not a rejection of the world. It is a deeper engagement with it. For the person of faith does not abandon responsibility. On the contrary, faith intensifies responsibility. It demands that the individual act without any assurance that the act will succeed. It demands that he trust a truth he cannot fully articulate. It demands that he stake his entire life on something that cannot be demonstrated. This is why faith is not passive. Faith is action sharpened by inward passion. And the price of this passion is loneliness. The person who lives ethically can always explain himself. His actions fit universal principles. His decisions are understandable to others. But the person who lives by faith makes decisions that the world cannot comprehend. His commitment is invisible from the outside. His inward relationship with the absolute does not translate neatly into rational discourse. Others will call him irrational, reckless, delusional. They will accuse him of violating ethical norms. They will misunderstand him because faith cannot be shared. It can only be lived. Kierkegaard calls this solitude the highest form of subjectivity. The self becomes fully itself only when it stands alone with God, stripped of every external justification. This is why faith is not an escape from individuality, but its ultimate expression. The leap is not a leap away from the self, but a leap into the deepest possible form of selfhood. Yet faith remains impossible to those who demand certainty. The modern individual, especially in the world of 2025, is conditioned to rely on data, probability, predictability. He seeks security through information, comfort through control. But faith demands vulnerability. It demands the courage to move without clarity. It demands the willingness to endure the absurd without fleeing back into ethical rigidity or aesthetic distraction. The leap cuts away every illusion of safety. The self that cannot tolerate uncertainty remains trapped in despair. But the self that accepts uncertainty begins to transform. In the act of committing beyond reason, the individual discovers a new form of interior strength. He no longer relies on external systems for validation. He no longer needs approval to confirm his decisions. He no longer fears the collapse of old structures, because his grounding is no longer in structure, but in inward passion. Faith becomes the architecture of his existence. In this sense, faith is not irrational. It is supra-rational. It does not contradict reason. It surpasses it. Reason can bring the self to the boundary of meaning, but it cannot carry the self across that boundary. Faith is the movement that completes what reason begins. This movement is not a rejection of understanding, but the fulfillment of understanding through action. Faith is thought becoming being. The individual who embraces faith lives differently. He lives with intensity because every decision becomes sacred. He lives with humility because he knows the limits of reason. He lives with courage because he has already risked the greatest risk, himself. And he lives with compassion because he understands how difficult it is for others to leap. He does not preach. He does not coerce. He does not impose belief. He respects the loneliness of the inward journey because he has endured it. Yet faith also creates tension within the individual. For faith does not remove contradictions, it illuminates them. The person of faith lives in permanent paradox, the paradox of freedom and dependence, of finitude and infinitude, of rational clarity and irrational commitment. He feels the strain of this paradox daily, but instead of collapsing under it, he draws strength from it. For paradox is the language of existence when existence is understood honestly. Faith teaches the self to breathe inside contradiction. But the leap of faith is not a single moment. It is a rhythm. It must be renewed again and again, especially when life becomes difficult. Kierkegaard rejects the idea of faith as static. Faith is a continual movement, a perpetual choosing, a repeated act of grounding oneself in the absolute rather than in the instability of the world. Without renewal, faith dissolves back into despair or complacency. This continual renewal reveals faith as discipline rather than sentiment. Faith is not experienced, it is practiced. It is the daily decision to trust inward truth, even when outward circumstances contradict it. It is the refusal to surrender to fear. It is the refusal to escape into triviality. It is the refusal to collapse into cynicism. It is the refusal to live by probabilities when existence demands passion. Faith demands the whole self, nothing less. And because faith demands the whole self, it creates a new form of human nobility. The individual who lives by faith becomes capable of acts that the ethical person cannot fathom. He becomes capable of absolute commitment. He becomes capable of absolute sacrifice. He becomes capable of absolute love. Not because he is stronger, but because he is grounded in something that transcends calculation. His life is shaped not by what is reasonable, but by what is true in the inward sense. But nothing exposes the depth of faith like the moment when it collides with the ethical. It is easy to imagine faith as harmonious, but Kierkegaard insists that faith is born precisely when harmony breaks. Faith is not a smoother path, it is a steeper one. It challenges ethical expectations. It isolates the believer. It demands choices that cannot be publicly justified. And in this collision, the true dimension of the leap becomes visible. For the highest expression of faith, the point where inward commitment reaches its most excruciating test, is found not in abstraction, but in a human story. A story where obedience to the absolute overturns ethical certainty, where love and duty collide in unbearable tension, and where the solitary individual stands before God with nothing but trembling resolve. A story that Kierkegaard chooses as the symbol of ultimate inward courage, the symbol of faith pushed beyond all comprehension, the symbol of a self willing to risk everything in the name of the absolute. Faith proves its weight in the story of Abraham, for Abraham embodies the extremity of inward commitment when every external structure collapses. Kierkegaard turns to this figure not to glorify obedience or to sanctify violence, but to reveal the irreducible paradox at the center of authentic existence. Abraham is the knight of faith because he stands alone in a collision that no ethical reasoning can survive. He embodies a form of inward greatness that the world cannot understand, cannot imitate, and cannot judge, because the movement he makes is invisible to everyone but himself and God. Abraham is asked to sacrifice Isaac, not metaphorically, not symbolically, not imaginatively. The command is literal, and in this command, every ethical principle shatters, every duty collapses, Every rational certainty dissolves. Abraham becomes incomprehensible to his time, to his family, to himself. And yet he rises early in the morning, saddles the donkey, and walks toward the mountain with a calmness that Kierkegaard calls terrifying. Why terrifying? Because Abraham is not a fanatic. He is not delirious. He is not confused. He knows exactly what he is doing. And he knows that what he is doing is ethically monstrous. He knows that killing Isaac violates every law of morality, every duty of fatherhood, every commandment of human decency. Yet he proceeds, not because ethics is irrelevant, but because he stands before a higher demand that ethics cannot comprehend. Abraham becomes the singular individual who steps beyond the universal. Kierkegaard insists that ethics is the universal, the set of duties binding all individuals alike. Ethics demands transparency, rational justification, shared responsibility. But Abraham cannot justify his act. He cannot explain it. He cannot defend it. He cannot speak it into coherence. His silence is not stubbornness. It is necessity. No one could understand the movement he is making because the movement is inward, paradoxical, grounded not in universal principles, but in an absolute relation to the absolute. To the world, Abraham looks like a murderer. To the ethical mind, he is a criminal. To the aesthetic mind, he is insane. To the rational mind, he is incomprehensible. But to Kierkegaard, Abraham is the individual at the highest point of existence, standing alone. Ethical categories break. His greatness is not in obedience, but in the inward suffering he carries as he walks toward the impossible command. Abraham's trial reveals that faith is not comfort, it is agony. The knight of faith does not leap joyfully. He trembles, he suffers, he feels the horror of what he is about to do. But he does not flee from it. He holds the paradox in his chest with a steadiness that no ethical system can produce. Abraham believes two contradictory truths at once. He believes that God demands Isaac's sacrifice, and he believes, with equal intensity, that God will not take Isaac from him. He walks in a contradiction that reason cannot tolerate. This is the absurd. This is faith. Faith is the movement beyond rational contradiction into inward truth. It is not irrationality. It is supra-rationality. It is the strength to hold paradox without collapsing. Abraham lives inside contradiction without dissolving into despair or madness. The ethical person cannot do this. The crowd cannot do this. The individual who relies on reason alone cannot do this. Only the knight of faith can stand with such unbearable tension and remain whole. The world desires heroes it can understand. Abraham is not one of them. Ethical heroes act for universal principles that anyone can recognize. Their courage is admirable because it is shareable. Their story is repeatable. Their motivation is communicable. But Abraham's courage cannot be translated. No one can imitate him without becoming a murderer. No one can follow his example without destroying the ethical order. And yet, Abraham is the father of faith. This is the paradox. The highest form of inward commitment appears outwardly as the highest crime. Abraham suspends the ethical, not to abolish it, but to obey a command that transcends it. Abraham's suspension is not rebellion. It is not self-assertion. It is not expression of personal desire. It is the opposite. It is absolute submission to the absolute. It is inward surrender to a demand that exceeds comprehension. This surrender is not passive. It is active, deliberate, excruciating. It requires a form of courage that ethics cannot produce, because ethics seeks security and clarity. Faith accepts insecurity and paradox as its soil. Abraham's torment is not that he doubts the command, but that he understands the horror of fulfilling it. To obey ethically is simple. One follows universal law. To obey aesthetically is selfish. One follows desire. To obey by faith is unbearable. One follows a command that annihilates one's own understanding. Abraham's inward suffering is his greatness. He does not anesthetize himself with certainty. He does not rationalize. He does not flee into the crowd. He does not ask for approval. Approval would be impossible. Explanation would be absurd. Faith isolates the individual more completely than any external exile. The loneliness of Abraham's walk is the loneliness of the single individual whose relationship with God cannot be shared, interpreted, or validated. It is a silence deeper than psychological solitude. It is metaphysical solitude. The crowd cannot accompany him. Ethics cannot support him. Reason cannot illuminate the path. He walks into darkness carrying only inward passion and the knife. This image becomes the symbol of faith's violence, not violence against others, but violence against the self that clings to rational assurance. The knife is the fracture point between ethics and faith. It marks the moment where Abraham must act without understanding. Faith is not contemplation. Faith is action that contradicts contemplation. The knight of faith does not merely believe, he moves. Movement is what distinguishes faith from fantasy. The aesthete imagines, the ethical person deliberates, the knight of faith acts. And the action reveals the truth of his inward commitment. But Abraham's story also exposes the terrible risk of faith. The ethical realm provides public clarity. Faith provides no such clarity. The individual may misinterpret. The inward voice may not be God, but delusion. The command may not be divine, but madness. Faith provides no external validation, no test, no verification. Faith demands that the individual risk error at the deepest level. This is why most people remain in the ethical stage. The risk of faith is unbearable. Yet, Kierkegaard insists that the absolute relation to the absolute cannot be achieved without this risk. The knight of faith must place his entire being on the line. The possibility of error is not a flaw, but a condition of authentic faith. Without the risk of error, faith becomes imitation. Without inward isolation, faith becomes conformity. Without the paradox, faith becomes morality. The knight of faith is not morally superior. He is inwardly transformed. Abraham does not abandon Isaac emotionally. He loves him more intensely because he risks losing him absolutely. This is the paradox of faith. Surrender everything while believing one will receive it back. Abraham climbs the mountain, not with resignation, but with hope. He hopes for the impossible. He hopes against the evidence of reason. He hopes in direct contradiction to ethical logic. Hope becomes the pulse of faith. Hope is not optimism. It is defiance. Faith defies despair, not by denying suffering, but by refusing to collapse under it. Abraham embraces despair fully, yet does not succumb. This capacity to hold despair and hope simultaneously is the essence of the knight of faith. The ethical person cannot do this. The ethical life seeks consistency. Faith embraces contradiction because existence itself is contradictory. This embrace is not madness. It is spiritual maturity. And yet, Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac is not the final word. The command is withdrawn. The knife does not fall. Isaac lives. But Kierkegaard warns, Abraham does not know this beforehand. His greatness lies not in the outcome, but in the inward movement he made before the outcome became visible. The true sacrifice was not Isaac, but Abraham's certainty. He relinquished understanding, control, ethical coherence. And in relinquishing these, he discovered a form of selfhood deeper than rational identity, deeper than moral identity, deeper than psychological identity. Abraham becomes a singular individual, not because he obeyed, but because he suffered the paradox with full consciousness. This suffering reveals the highest structure of subjectivity. Faith transforms the self not by providing answers, but by deepening inward responsibility. The knight of faith stands before God without illusions. He knows the fragility of his own interpretation, the trembling nature of his commitment, the uncertainty of his path, and yet he acts. The world seeks assurance before action. Faith acts before assurance. This reversal is the essence of the leap. The leap is not irrational impulse. It is rationality pushed to its limit. Abraham's story becomes the archetype of this limit. It shows how far inwardness can stretch before breaking, and how faith holds the paradox together where reason fails. It shows that the relationship with the absolute cannot be mediated by ethics, knowledge, or public justification. It must be lived from the interior, in solitude, with trembling. And once Abraham descends the mountain, once Isaac breathes again, once the paradox has revealed its terrifying truth, another dimension of existence begins to emerge. A dimension that no longer concerns only the individual before God, but the individual returning to the world. carrying inward transformation into ordinary life, where the challenge is no longer the extraordinary leap, but the quiet, relentless task of living faithfully in the everyday. Abraham descends the mountain changed, yet nothing around him appears changed. The sheep still graze, the servants still wait, Isaac still walks beside him. Life resumes its ordinary shape, quiet and deceptively simple. But Abraham is no longer the man who climbed upward in trembling obedience. He has crossed the threshold between ethical clarity and absolute inwardness. And now he must live, not in the blaze of revelation, but in the slow, steady rhythm of everyday existence. This is the hidden difficulty of faith. Not the moment of the leap, but the long return to the ordinary after the extraordinary has shattered the self. For the knight of faith does not remain on the mountain. He comes back to the world. Kierkegaard insists that true faith does not withdraw from life. It returns to it, transformed, but outwardly indistinguishable. The knight of faith pays taxes, engages in conversation, raises children, buys bread, and performs the rituals of the everyday with an ease that conceals his inward intensity. Unlike the knight of infinite resignation, who retreats from the world into noble suffering, the knight of faith re-enters the world fully, joyfully, without fanfare. His faith does not isolate him from daily life. It sanctifies it. This is the paradox. The highest inwardness produces the most ordinary exterior. Abraham, having prepared to lose Isaac absolutely, embraces Isaac again with absolute gratitude. Nothing outward explains this joy. Nothing visible marks his inward transformation. The ethical person cannot see it. The aesthetic person cannot conceive it. Only the one who has stood alone before God understands that ordinary life becomes extraordinary after the paradox has been endured. The knight of faith moves through the world with quiet intensity, not dramatic intensity, not mystical abstraction, quiet intensity, the kind that arises when the individual knows that every moment contains the infinite. He has seen that life can demand everything. He has seen that certainty is impossible. He has seen that existence requires leaps rather than proofs. And because he has endured this, he receives each ordinary moment with a depth the world cannot measure. The world judges faith by its external expressions. But the essence of faith is inward, invisible, silent. This invisibility is essential. If faith were visible, it would become imitation. If it produced special behaviors or recognizable traits, people would mimic them without undergoing inward transformation. Kierkegaard fears nothing more than counterfeit faith, the cheap reproduction of what only suffering and paradox can produce. Thus, the knight of faith disappears into the ordinary while carrying the extraordinary within him. This disappearing is not retreat, it is integration. The individual integrates the paradox into daily life, allowing faith to shape not only monumental decisions, but small gestures, passing conversations, subtle choices. Faith becomes the atmosphere in which he breathes, rather than a dramatic stance he performs. In this way, the knight of faith is both the most extraordinary and the most ordinary person alive. His extraordinariness is inward, his ordinariness is outward. No contradiction troubles him because he lives inside paradox already. He needs no audience. He needs no validation. His grounding is not in the approval of others or in the coherence of ethical systems, but in the inward relation to the absolute that no circumstance can disrupt. But returning to the world does not mean freedom from struggle. If anything, the struggle deepens. The individual must now navigate existence without the dramatic clarity of crisis. In crisis, the self is focused. In daily life, the self drifts unless inwardly anchored. The knight of faith must guard his inwardness while engaging fully in the tasks that appear trivial. This is harder than facing the extraordinary. Many can endure suffering heroically. Few can remain inwardly true in the monotony of daily life. The ethical person thrives in stable routines. The knight of infinite resignation thrives in noble suffering. But the knight of faith must thrive in ordinary life without losing the inward absolute. This is the highest challenge of existence, to be present in the finite without losing relation to the infinite. Here lies the danger. The world of 2025 is saturated with noise, distraction, speed. It is easier to lose inwardness in the comfort of routine than in the face of crisis. The individual who has made the leap may find the ordinary more treacherous than the extraordinary. For the ordinary erodes passion quietly. The extraordinary tests the self violently. The ordinary tests it silently. Abraham must wake up tomorrow and live without the drama of the mountain. The memory of the command lingers, but no new command follows. Now he must live as a father, a husband, a member of the community. But beneath these roles lies a transformed self that must continually renew its faith in silence. The knight of faith repeats the movement inwardly every day. He resigns everything infinitely every morning, and every morning he receives everything back with joy. This repetition is the heartbeat of faith. Without repetition, faith decays into memory. Without inward renewal, it becomes nostalgia. Faith is not what the self once did. It is what the self continues to do. Repetition appears outwardly dull. Inwardly, it is heroic. The self must recreate its relation to the absolute with every new circumstance. Faith has no autopilot. It requires continual alertness. It requires the courage to confront the absurd in the mundane. It requires the humility to accept that inward transformation is never finished. Faith is not an achievement, it is a movement. Thus, the knight of faith remains vulnerable, not to despair, but to complacency. Complacency is inward death disguised as comfort. The world applauds comfort because it cannot understand inward passion. But the knight of faith does not seek comfort. He seeks depth. He seeks truth. He seeks to live the paradox fully while performing the ordinary tasks of existence with grace. Kierkegaard sees in Abraham the model for this integration. Abraham does not spend his life retelling the story of the sacrifice. He lives, he acts, he loves, he participates, he engages. Nothing about his outward life draws attention, but inwardly he remains in the posture of the leap. He remains grounded in absolute reliance on God. His every action carries the echo of the mountain. Yet something else emerges from this integration, something that neither ethics nor aesthetics can provide. Faith produces joy, not as pleasure or excitement, but as inward rest in the midst of uncertainty. Joy becomes possible precisely because the individual no longer seeks security from the world. He no longer builds his identity from fragile circumstances. His grounding is inward, and therefore he can love the world freely. This freedom is not detachment. It is deeper attachment. The knight of faith loves with more intensity because he is not afraid to lose. He hopes with more fervor because he has already faced hopelessness. He acts with more courage because he no longer depends on outcomes for meaning. This is why Abraham can embrace Isaac not with anxiety, but with gratitude. He has already surrendered him. He has already received him back inwardly. His love has passed through the fire of paradox and emerged purified. The return to the world is the final test of inwardness. Anyone can stand on a mountain in isolation. The true trial is living in the marketplace with faith intact. It is here, in the noise and repetition of daily life, that inward authenticity is either confirmed or lost. The knight of faith remains invisible because his transformation is interior. But this invisibility is the mark of the highest form of existence. For after faith has endured paradox, after it has survived the impossible demand, after it has returned to the world, one final question begins to rise in the heart of the individual. A question that pushes the self beyond inwardness itself toward the deepest confrontation of all. The question that rises after faith is not how to leap again, but how to live with the weight of having leapt. The individual who has passed through anxiety, despair, decision, and the paradox of Abraham now faces a deeper and quieter challenge: how to exist meaningfully in a world that does not share his inward transformation. This confrontation with meaning is not theoretical, it is existential. Once the self knows that inward truth surpasses external structures, it must ask what it means to live day after day in alignment with that truth. Meaning is not a discovery waiting in the world. Meaning is an achievement of inwardness. The crowd treats meaning as something external, a career, a relationship, a social role, a measurable success. The ethical person treats meaning as duty, the fulfillment of obligations, the stability of moral identity. The aesthete treats meaning as experience, pleasure, novelty, stimulation. But the individual who has passed through faith knows that none of these can carry the full weight of existence. Meaning cannot be handed down, inherited, or purchased. It cannot be guaranteed by culture or secured by reason. It must be wrestled from within. Yet the paradox of this wrestling is that it must occur in the world, not apart from it. Faith transforms the individual inwardly, but the world remains unchanged. The marketplace continues. The routines persist. The expectations of society still exert their pressure. And the individual must engage with all of it, not as an escape from inwardness, but as the arena where inwardness proves itself. Meaning emerges not in the extraordinary moments, but in the ordinary ones, when the self quietly aligns its actions with its deepest commitments. The challenge is that the world does not reward inward coherence. The world rewards performance. It rewards image. It rewards efficiency, conformity, predictability. In such a world, the inward individual faces the constant temptation to hide his depths behind social masks, to speak in the language the crowd understands, to reduce his inner transformation to palatable expressions, to shrink himself to fit the expectations of those who cannot see the paradox that has reshaped him. And yet, meaning requires refusing this shrinkage. Meaning requires preserving inward truth, even when outward circumstances demand compromise. Meaning requires a kind of courage that does not look like heroism. It looks like integrity. It looks like quiet refusal. It looks like remaining faithful to one's inner orientation, even when no one notices. This is the burden of post-faith existence. Abraham returns to life, knowing that his meaning comes from a relation no one else can measure. So too must the individual navigate the world without expecting recognition. The inward life is invisible. The outward world values visibility. The tension between these two realities is the birthplace of existential meaning. Meaning is not discovered by aligning with social values, but by standing apart from them while participating fully in the world they create. Meaning demands presence without absorption. The self must remain open to experience without losing inward grounding. It must engage with others without dissolving into them. It must love without possession, work without self-abandonment, create without self-inflation. This balance is delicate. It requires continual inward vigilance. Without vigilance, the self slips back into the crowd's gravitational pull, where meaning is replaced by imitation and depth evaporates into performance. But vigilance alone is not enough. Meaning is not sustained by resistance. It is sustained by creation. The individual must build a life that expresses its inward commitment. This expression does not require grandeur. It does not require public achievement. It requires authenticity. To choose work that aligns with one's nature rather than with the expectations of society. To cultivate relationships grounded in honesty rather than habit. To speak words shaped by inward depth rather than by external pressure. To act in ways that reflect a self that has faced despair and survived it. Meaning is not a possession, it is a practice. The self constructs meaning through living truthfully in a world that prefers illusion. This is why Kierkegaard emphasizes that the single individual must stand alone even while living among others. Meaning is not negotiated collectively. It is forged in solitude and expressed in community. It is born inwardly and revealed outwardly. It requires both isolation and involvement. And yet meaning also requires endurance. There will be days when inward truth feels heavy, when the world feels louder than the voice within, when the temptation to return to the comfort of unexamined living becomes seductive. The individual who has made the leap will feel this pull, not once, but repeatedly. The ordinary world does not care about paradox. It does not respect inward transformation. It simply continues. To live meaningfully within it is to accept that inwardness will often feel out of place, misunderstood, even burdensome. But this burden is the mark of freedom. A self that has been awakened cannot return to sleep. A self that has passed through despair cannot be satisfied with distraction. A self that has leapt into faith cannot pretend that meaning can be found externally. The burden of freedom is the price of authenticity. The burden is not a flaw, but a sign that the self has become real. Meaning deepens not when life becomes easier, but when the individual becomes more capable of bearing its contradictions. And yet meaning is not merely endurance, it is joy. Not the joy of pleasure or excitement, but the joy of living in alignment with one's inward truth. The joy of knowing that one's actions reflect one's essence. The joy of participating in the world without being enslaved by it. The joy of belonging, not to the crowd, but to oneself. This joy is subtle but powerful. It does not announce itself. It grows quietly in the spaces where the self acts from authenticity rather than fear. It appears in moments when the individual realizes he no longer needs validation to feel real. It strengthens as the self becomes more integrated, more coherent, more transparent to itself. But meaning also invites a final question, not the question of freedom or despair or ethical responsibility or faith. A question deeper than any of these. A question that arises only when the individual has lived long enough with inwardness to confront the mystery at the core of existence. The question of the self's ultimate grounding. For inward truth, no matter how deep, eventually demands a further movement, one that reaches beyond meaning itself toward the absolute source of meaning, where the individual must confront the final paradox of being human. A life becomes human only when the individual dares to stand before himself without disguise. This is the unrelenting demand running beneath Kierkegaard's entire philosophy. It does not ask for brilliance, no heroism, no public virtue. It asks for honesty, the kind that strips away every borrowed conviction until the self meets its own naked truth. The journey through crowd, individuality, anxiety, despair, choice, faith, and the trembling solitude of Abraham reveals a single piercing lesson. Becoming oneself is the rarest courage a human being can possess. Most will not take this path. The crowd offers too much comfort. The aesthetic life offers too much distraction. The ethical life offers too much stability. Only a few are willing to descend into the depths where anxiety unmasks freedom, where despair exposes the false self, where choice demands responsibility, and where faith tears open the paradox of existence. And yet the invitation remains, silent, persistent, unavoidable. To live authentically is to accept that meaning cannot be inherited. It must be created through inward commitment. It is to understand that no external authority can define your path, and no collective voice can absolve your decisions. It is to realize that the self is not a role, but a task, not a possession, but a becoming. And this becoming asks for the kind of vigilance that cannot be outsourced, the kind of solitude that cannot be avoided, the kind of courage that cannot be faked. Kierkegaard does not offer comfort. He offers clarity. He does not lead us toward tranquility. He leads us toward responsibility. He does not promise that the path of inwardness is easy. He promises only that it is real. And reality, once confronted, demands everything: your illusions, your defenses, your unquestioned loyalties, your fear of standing alone. But in giving everything, you receive the one thing the crowd can never grant: a life that is truly your own. This is the final challenge he leaves us with. Dare to exist. Dare to choose. Dare to confront the truth that you alone must decide what it means to be you. In a world that rewards imitation and punishes depth, this daring is the purest form of freedom and the beginning of a life lived in full.